Truly, we all have times in our life when circumstances overwhelm us with fear and sorrow and anxiety. We feel that we are being consumed by fire, drowning in a raging river of despair. For that is how the death of a spouse, disability, job loss, divorce can feel. Yet we are assured that as Jesus Christ redeemed people, we are not abandoned and we are not forgotten. Because we have been called by name, and we belong to Him. In Christ, each one of us is known by God and know God. We are brought into a deep, intimate, loving relationship that gives us with true spiritual life. And He calls us precious, beloved. He comes to us physically through other people, often through our brothers and sisters in Christ. Through them, He surrounds us with compassion and kindness. One man developed dementia at a very early age. Ironically, he had been a chaplain in a nursing home and had a lot of experience caring for those who had this disease. One of the hardest things he had to do was come to terms with being in a position of needing care rather than giving care. Family members contacted me and requested a Stephen minister. They needed a caregiver to be with this man as he struggled to come to terms with what was happening to him. Someone with whom he could speak who was not a family member and not a friend. Somebody that he could speak openly and honestly with. Someone who would assure him that God was still with him. So a Stephen minister was matched with him. In the early stages of this disease, he was very articulate about what he was experiencing. But as the disease progressed, he became less and less able to communicate. The Stephen minister took him out every week, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for a drive, sometimes here to our noon-hour concerts. When this man lost his ability to remember and communicate, his love for music remained with him, and our noon-hour concerts were a great blessing to him. Both he and his family went through fire and flood, but they didn't go through this alone. Their Stephen minister gave them the support, the compassion, and the care of Christ. When Paul wrote to the Christians in Colossae, he told them to clothe themselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience. He said, above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. These are all attributes which foster spiritual caregiving, for they empower us to bear one another's burdens, as Paul instructed the Galatian church to do. It is these attributes, heart and mind and spirit, which sustain us with dignity when we are broken. They reach out to us and give us hope when we are overwhelmed. When the death of a spouse, the death of our child, the death of a close friend overwhelms us in a deep river of sadness. When the report of a terminal illness tortures us with fear, when anxiety over unemployment threats to sink us into a deep hole we just can't climb out of, Stephen minister will come alongside, a reassuring presence to whom we can rant and rave or walk with in silence. Most people are much more open to giving care than to receiving care. There are many people who, though they really would benefit from a Stephen minister, tough it out on their own. Our society teaches us that to ask for help is to admit weakness, and to show weakness is to admit vulnerability. But suffering alone is not God's intention for us. Our Stephen ministers know all about receiving care. Many of them have been on the receiving end of the care at an earlier point in their life, and this has motivated them to give care now. They know how difficult it is to ask for help, but they also know the great personal and spiritual healing that comes from caregiving and receiving care. They are equipped, ready, and waiting to provide the comfort and care God very much desires us to have. Stephen ministers as spiritual caregivers share Christ's presence with us by listening fully and completely, and allow us to express our pain and fear and know that we have been fully heard. They listen without judgment and without giving advice. Jesus promised, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." We receive this promised rest when we turn to one another for comfort and for support. When anxiety for our children, fear of an impending life change that threatens our independence, or a flood of stress descends as we cope with caring for a loved one, a Stephen minister will come alongside and help us carry these burdens by praying with us and for us, listening fully to our fears, and speaking words of hope, assuring us that God in Christ calls us by name. We are